Add your washed rose hips into a large pan, having snapped off any remaining stems and tops. You can also add any rose hips that you may previously have frozen if you weren't able to use them straight away. In fact, some sources say that it even improves the flavour to freeze them for a bit. I'm going to rinse them and add them to the pan. And however many rose hips you have in the pan, just cover them with water up until a little bit over the top of the surface. I brought the rose hips to a boil, and now I've turned the heat down and I'm going to simmer them for a while until they're soft enough to mash. Now the time that takes depends on the rose hips. If they're hard, it will be considerably longer. If they're softer, or if often from the freezer they're softer, then it'll take a shorter time. We'll check them after maybe 10 to 15 minutes. I'm going to cover them slightly. So this is after about 15 minutes. I'm going to leave them on for a little bit longer because although it's mashing, most of it's mashing well, I used a mixture of rose hips and some of the harder ones are taking longer, so I'll just give it a little bit longer. This is a first straining, which I've been doing through a colander to allow the rich first flush to come through. It's been sitting there about a couple of hours or so, but you could equally leave it overnight to let more of that richness come through naturally. But I'm going to return this to the pan now and add more water. Let's try that. Give it a stir. Again, it depends on the quantity of rose hips you have as to how much water you add, but if you aim for this sort of consistency, more or less, it's not an exact science. I've mashed them up some more and now I'm going to restrain it. Having spent the night draining through the colander or sieve, if that's what you used, we're going to strain it some more times now to get rid of the residual bits, seeds, and especially the fine hairs, which are irritant. And for that you can either use a fine mesh sieve if you have one, or a regular sieve lined with clean muslin or cheesecloth or something similar. Here's the consistency from the first two strainings added together. You can see it's quite syrupy looking even before any sugar at all is added. This one's discoloured because it's been regularly used. It's easier for the liquid to go through when the material's wet, so I'm just pouring over boiling water. To sterilise the bottles or jars if you're using, wash them in warm soapy water, rinse thoroughly, and make sure that the bottles don't have any damage, that they're quite sturdy glass. I've got lids boiling there for about 10 minutes or so while these are going to go in the oven. Most sources say somewhere between 130 to 180 Celsius for 10 to 15 minutes. I've also separated them from each other on a rack. The other thing I've done is I've put the lip of the rack at the back so that they don't slip out when you take them out of the oven. Lift the lids out onto a clean tea towel to drain, and if the rosehip is still going you can turn the oven off and leave the bottles in there until we're going to use them. The amount of sugar you now add to make your syrup depends on how sweet and syrupy you want it to be. I've got about 1 litre there, so I could add 1 kilogram, or I could halve that, 500 grams. I'm actually going to go less sugar than that. I'm using a mixture of white and golden granulated because that's what I have in. We've been stirring the syrup regularly or even constantly to make sure that all of the sugar has dissolved, and now let it boil for a couple of minutes before decanting. You can skim off any scum that's formed on the top. I've run boiling water through those funnels and now starting to decant into the warm bottles. You don't want the bottles to crack. Very slowly and carefully, obviously, because this is extremely hot. I've poured this syrup in up to ½ an inch or so from the top and tightened the lids, and the remainder, which didn't fill that jar, we'll start using it straight away. Properly sterilised bottles and jars of syrup should last a few months if stored on the shelf, or if you've used a low ratio of sugar then in the fridge. Once they're opened, of course, keep them in the fridge and use them within a week or so. I find they're often fine for longer, but you'll know if it's begun fermenting. But if you want your syrup to last for up to a year or more, then look online to see how to process the bottles of syrup in a water bath, for which you'll need a pot that's tall enough for boiling water to reach up quite high up to the sides of the bottles. It's not difficult, and it means that you'll have rosehip for use all year round. And finally, make a note of the date and details so you have a record, and then you can make some labels as and when you wish with the date and provenance.